Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
This serves as an introduction to Power Query if you've never used it before, whilst also showcasing some of the best tools available in the application to tidy up a dataset. My name is Deborah Ashby. I'm a Microsoft MVP and instructor, and I've been using Power Query for probably about 10 years now, so a little bit of time. So let's take a quick look at the agenda, what we're going to be covering in the session. So for anybody who's new, we'll briefly go through exactly what Power Query is. And I'll start out by showing you an example of a messy dataset. You might be more familiar with working on messy datasets in Excel and maybe using things like Excel functions to tidy things up. I'm going to take a look at that, and then we're going to discuss the advantages of doing it in Power Query, and then we're going to tidy up a messy dataset using Power Query. And then we're going to talk a little bit about importing a text file with get and transform. We're going to take a look at the Power Query editor. So again, if you're not familiar with that and how that works and what all the different panes and ribbons are, we'll make sure that you're comfortable with that. And then we'll actually get into the fun part, which is cleaning up the data set with Power Query tools. So I'm not going to be able to run through absolutely everything, but we should be able to take a pretty horrendous data set and make it look really nice. Once we've tidied it up, we're then going to close and load it back into Excel. And we're going to create ourselves a little pivot table and pivot chart. And then I'm going to show you how easy it is to update and refresh all of the data if your file changes or if a new file gets added to the folder. So quite a few things to run through just there. Power Query can be used for many different things, not just cleaning data. I've listed some of them just here. So it is great for cleaning up data, and it's great for combining data as well. So if you have lots of different files that are all of a similar layout and you want to combine them all together, you can do that in Power Query. You can transform your data, you can refresh your data, and you can automate things as well. We're just going to focus on data cleaning, but just be aware that it's not just a data cleaning application. Now, a lot of the time, if you're working with data, it might be that you've downloaded a data set from maybe something like a third-party application. So if you maybe download a file every single week, it might be that that file comes into Excel and it's not in the most perfect format. And we always find that with data sets, particularly if they're not data sets that we've personally created, they're downloads, the data won't always be perfect. It won't be lined up in nice columns and rows. So we have to know a few skills in Excel in order to be able to get that data into a state so that it can be analyzed. Because most of the time, particularly with data sets like this is a very large data set, I'm probably going to want to analyze this by converting it into a pivot table and then maybe creating a chart or maybe creating a dashboard. But I can't do it if it looks like this, if it has lots of different things in here which shouldn't be there. So looking at this data set just here, you can probably see immediately some things that we would have to tidy up in order to be able to analyze this successfully. We have blank rows in here. We probably want to get rid of all of those. We have things like weird spacing going on in column F. You can see that Annie Thurman is kind of nudged across the cell. We have some inconsistent case. So you can see the first two items here in column G are in uppercase and everything else is in proper case. We might have spelling mistakes in here that we want to check. We might decide that we want to replace certain items within this spreadsheet. So there's lots of things that we could do to tidy this data set up and make it look a lot better. And historically, before we had Power Query, let's imagine we live in that type of world again, we would do this in Excel, and we'd do it using a combination of utilities such as GoToSpecial to find all of the blanks. We would use maybe formulas, add in helper columns and clean up these columns using things like proper, trim, those types of formulas. And I will say that you can still do that. So if you're somebody who currently cleans up data using Excel formulas and utilities, that is absolutely fine. But there is a drawback to doing that, and this is where Power Query can be more helpful. If you can imagine, if I download this data set every week, so let's say every Friday, I download this data set with the latest update in it, I would have to tidy up that data set every single Friday, which is really, really time consuming. Whereas if you're using Power Query, you can just run the cleanup process once, and then you can effectively rerun it automatically on any other file that you add to the folder. So it's going to save you so much time. You don't have to go through the cleaning steps every single time you download the file. So that is the biggest advantage of using Power Query. The other big advantage, which you'll see in a moment when we open it up, is that it's so much easier. It's much easier to click a button that says trim as opposed to remembering the formula in Excel in order to clean up spaces in your data set. So that is sort of the reason why you might possibly want to switch to using Power Query. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to connect to our text file, and I just call this text file fakerholdingslimited.txt. It is fake sales data for a company that we've downloaded and we want to analyze. So what we can do here is, with a blank workbook open, we're going to go to the Data tab first of all. Notice here in the first group, we have Get and Transform Data. So this is where we can grab a file from numerous different locations. So it really depends where you have the file that you want to tidy up. So it might be that it's another Excel file. You could grab it from a different Excel workbook. Maybe it's a text file. You've got the text option there. Maybe it's a PDF that you want to tidy up, or you might choose to connect to an Access database. Maybe that's where your data's stored. So you can see that you have lots of different options when it comes to connecting to different storage areas for your files. Now, we've just got a text file, and let's just open it up and have a quick look at that text file up. Faker Holdings Limited. Now, this is currently pretty messy. You can see we've got sort of some titles at the top here, some column headings, but nothing below really lines up with its column heading. So I'm not entirely sure how this is going to come across into Excel, but I'm going to guess that it's probably going to be pretty messy and it's going to require quite a bit of fiddling around with. So let's close it down, and we're going to connect to the text file. So in the Get and Transform Data group, we're going to click on From Text/CSV. And this is going to take us to File Explorer, where we can then go in and we can find the file that we want to use. So we're going to select Faker Holdings and we're going to import it. So what this is effectively doing now is it's basically connecting to that data source. We're connecting Excel to our text file. And you can see it's popped open this window with a very quick, brief analysis of the text file that I've connected to. And it's only going to show me the first 200 rows. It's like a sample, so you can see what it looks like. Now, at this stage, we have a couple of different choices. If you take a look down the bottom, you can see that we've got Load and we've got Transform Data. So if I wanted to, I could choose to just load this data directly into the Excel spreadsheet. So if you wanted to, if you decided that you wanted to clean up your data set in Excel using formulas and Excel utilities, that's absolutely fine. You could just do load and it will load it directly into the Excel spreadsheet. However, we don't want to do that. We want to transform our data using Power Query instead. So we're going to click on the Transform Data button. And if you've never been in here before, then this can look a little bit intimidating, but it's actually not too bad. It has pretty much the same structure as all of the other Microsoft applications. So we have our ribbons running across the top. You can see I'm currently clicked on Home. We have a Transform ribbon, we have an Add Column ribbon, and we have a View ribbon up here. So that's pretty much it. And on these ribbons, we have all of the commands that we're going to need to do various things to this data set and tidy it up. What else do we have on this screen? Well, just below the ribbons, we have this formula bar area. So again, if you're used to using an application like Excel, this is a very similar structure. This is just showing us the formulas that sit behind whatever you're currently clicked on. Now, I will say for this, you don't really have to worry too much what's going on in this formula bar because everything we're going to be doing is down here in this grid area. Now, over on the left-hand side, you can see it just says queries down here. If I click the little arrow, it's going to expand that out. That's just going to show you the name of your file. So this is your query, effectively. Now, I like to keep this minimized just to give myself a little bit more screen space. Now, over on the right-hand side, this is where I think it's pretty interesting because what we have here underneath query settings is we have properties and we have name. So currently that says Faker Holdings Limited. Now, generally, if I'm about to clean a data set, I will change this to say Faker Holdings _clean or something like that, just so I know. So I'm just going to change this right now to clean _ data. I'm effectively changing the name of the query. So you'll see now, if I was to expand the queries panel, you can see that that name has updated on the left-hand side. And underneath that, this is where we have applied steps. And this is super interesting because this is where all of your steps get logged. This is like a recorder which records what you're doing. So it's a bit like, I guess you could say it's a bit like a macro. As you're doing things with your data set, it records each step of what you're doing. So this is why Power Query is really cool, because you can simply, when you have a new file, just rerun all of the steps again, and it will do it automatically because it's logging everything that you do. The other thing that applied steps is useful for is backtracking out of different things. So again, if you do something to this data set and you think, oh, that was a mistake, I'd like to undo, you can simply remove the step. So here, the last step was changed type. Now, that's something that Power Query did automatically when I loaded up my data. So what I could do here is I could remove this step by clicking on the cross, and it's basically going to go back a step in the process. All right, so it's like doing a Control Z. So the applied steps area is really, really cool. Now that we've got all that said, we understand a little bit more about what we're looking at on this screen, it's time to start cleaning up this data set. If we take a look at this very first top row, you can see it says Faker Holdings Limited. And then we've got some column headings up here, but it's a bit hit and miss as to whether they have things in them. So don't have anything there. And then we've just got _1, _2, _3. This doesn't mean anything to me. What I want to have are all of my different column headings in here. So order number, order date, product, category, things like that. But notice, because of the data set that we've imported, all of those column headings are down here in row 4, and they're all in the same column. I effectively want these to be right at the top of each column. So that's something that we're going to have to deal with. I can also see that there is a spelling error where we have quantity as well. So we're going to want to deal with that. What else might I want to remove from here? Well, we have row 5 has got some weird things in it. We just have some pipe symbols and some dashes. That's not very good for my final data set, so I'm probably going to want to remove that. What else do we have? Well, we've got some blank rows, probably going to want to get rid of those. And if I look at the actual data, I can see that in this column just here, for example, we have product name and the category that that product belongs to in the same column. So I'm probably going to want to split those up across 2 different columns. I'm going to need to fix that. And if I take a look at my numbers, I can see, well, none of these have any formatting applied to them. I think this column just here is the price per unit, and this column just here, I think, is the quantity, and then we have the total at the end here. So I'm going to need to give all of these column headings, and I want to apply the correct data type to these. And then at the end here, we have another column which just has a few random numbers in it. Now, I think what's happened here is that when the data has come across, it's kind of got a bit out of sync, and these numbers actually belong in this column just here. You can see wherever there's a number, there's a blank in the previous column. So I'm probably going to want to somehow get these numbers merged across into this column. So those are most of the issues that we have going on with this data set. Now, if I was trying to do this in Excel, this is probably going to take me quite a long time, and I'm going to have to know quite a few different formulas and be pretty savvy with Excel in order to clean this successfully. The good news is with Power Query, we don't need to be that savvy because everything's written out in English and it's on a clickable button. So we can do things like remove rows and trim and clean and change the case of things. It's really, really simple. So let's start to go through and make this data set look pretty. The first thing I'm going to do, I can see up here in the first 3 rows, I kind of have some titles for this report. Now, I don't really want to include those in my actual table, my summary. So I'm going to remove the top 3 rows. So on the Home tab, we have a Reduce Rows group. We have a Remove Rows dropdown. And notice all the different options that we have in here because we're going to be coming back in here in a moment when we want to remove our blanks. So you can remove top rows from here, you can move bottom rows, you can remove alternate rows, duplicates, blank rows, and errors. So loads of stuff underneath here. And if you want to remove the top 3 rows, for example, you just say remove top rows, and it will ask you the number of rows you want to remove. So I'm going to say remove the top 3, click on OK, and those rows have now been removed. How simple is that? Let's deal with, if we scroll all the way across, if you remember, I said that we've got some numbers here which really need to be merged. Now we can do this again very simply in Power Query. All we need to do is select the column to merge, hold down Control and select the column to merge it into, and then if we go to the Transform tab, we have a Merge Columns option just here. So if I click Merge Columns, it's going to kind of squash these 2 together. Now, it's going to pop up this box. It's asking me if I have a separator. I don't. I've just got numbers in here. I can specify my new column name. Now, I'm just going to leave it on the default, which is merged, because we're going to go through and rename all of our columns at the end. So I'm just going to leave all of the default settings as they are. Let's click on OK and check it out. It's now merged those numbers into the column before, and notice it's just given it the column name merged. Really nice and straightforward. So merging columns is simple to do. What shall we deal with next? Let's scroll across and take a look. I think I'm going to get rid of these blank rows next. So we've already seen where we need to go to do that. It's on the Home tab, Remove Rows. We have an option to remove blank rows. Now, this isn't going to ask you to specify a number. It's literally just going to look for any row that is blank. So any row that doesn't have anything in any of the columns. That's what it considers a blank row. So let's click on it, and those blank rows are now done. Notice as I'm doing all of these things, check out the Applied Steps pane on the right-hand side. It's logging everything that I'm doing. It's showing me that I removed the top rows, I merged the columns, I removed the blank rows. And if I wanted to get those blank rows back again, remember, we can just click on the cross. It's going to undo that step, and I have my blank rows back. Okay, so really nice and straightforward. Let's get rid of those blank rows again. What shall we deal with next? Well, let's deal with this weird black line in row 2. So where we have this kind of pipe symbol and then we have some dashes, this was probably a separator in the original report that separated sort of the headings from the actual data. But for what we want to do, we don't need this. So how can we get rid of this? Well, what we can do is we can filter it out. Notice that we have little filter drop downs at the top of each column. So what I could do here is click the drop down. It's going to show me everything that we have in this column. But if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, can you see there is that weird dashed line? So all I would need to do is deselect it, click on OK, and it filters that line out. Okay, so you can use filters to filter out whatever you like of your data set. What should we do next? Well, let's go in and let's split up these column headings, because in this first column, this is where we have all of our column headings. They've all been squished into this one column. Now, I basically want order number is this column just here, order date is this column, product dash category is this column, so on and so forth. Now, in order to get to that stage where we have these at the top of each column, we need to do a couple of things first of all. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I need to split up this information so that we have these headings in separate columns. And we can split this up using a delimiter. So because we have this little line, I think they call it a pipe symbol, in between each of these headings, we can use that to tell Power Query that that is where we want to split into a new column. So with this column selected, we can go to split column, and I'm going to say by delimiter. Now you can choose whatever delimiter you like. So it depends. You might not have these lines, these pipe symbols. Maybe you have a space in there, or maybe you have a dash, or maybe you have a comma, and you want to split up using that delimiter. That is absolutely fine. You have different choices in here. And if you can't see the delimiter that's in use in your data set in this little list, you can always go for custom, which is what we're going to need to do because we don't have pipe listed up here. So if we go for custom, and then underneath we can specify what our delimiter is. So as is that line. So when I click on OK, check out what happens. It's going to split all of those into their own columns. Can you see that? We now have order number, order date, product category, price per unit, quantity, so on and so forth. Now notice underneath, apart from the order number, because that was the first column, order date, we've got null values. We have null values in all of these new columns. And that's because it's basically just created these new columns based off of the heading. The actual data is still all the way over here. So there is order date, there is product category, so on and so forth. So the next thing to do here is nudge this across to the correct column. Now, there are a couple of ways that we could do this. So if we start with the order date column, for example, I could do what we did previously. I could merge the two columns together in order to get that data across into this column. So if we go all the way across, I'll just show you for the first one here. So here are our order dates. I can select the order dates, go across to the order date column, hold down Control, and then I can go to Transform and merge those columns. So if I click Merge Columns, again, I'm just going to leave all of these on the defaults, click on OK, and it's merged them across. Okay, so that is a really nice way of doing it. Let's do it one more time so you can see that again. You need to select what you want to merge first of all. So we're going to go across to Product and Category, this column just here. Let's go back, hold down Control, select this column, and we can merge the columns. Click on OK. So you could do it that way. Now, if you have a lot of data, so I'm talking a lot of different columns, then you might think, oh, this is going to be really slow. Sometimes a quicker way of doing this is simply to delete out all of these columns with null in them and then just rename these columns just here. Okay, so what we could do here is we could select this column just here where we have our null values and go all the way across to this column, hold down Shift to select all of them, right click and just say remove columns. And then we can just go in and we can rename these columns to what they're supposed to be, which is what we're going to do in the next step. So you kind of have two different ways that you could deal with that. You can delete the columns and rename the headings, or you can merge the columns. It's entirely up to you. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to promote our top row so that those are our headings. Because if you take a look at our current headings, they're a bit all over the place. We have the actual file name as the heading in the first column. We have merged 1 as the heading in the second column, merged 2, and then _2, so on and so forth. And some of the headings that I want to use are actually in this first row just here. So order number, order date, product category. So what we can do is we can promote row 1 so that that becomes our heading row. If we go to the Home tab, in the Transform group, we have an option here, Use First Row as Headers. So as soon as I click that, it's going to pull it up and things are starting to take a bit more shape. We now have order number, order date, product category. Remember, these ones aren't named because we deleted them with those null values in. So I'm going to go through and just rename these columns. So all you need to do is double click where it says column 4 and you can type in whatever name for the column that you like. So this one is price unit. Double click the next one. This is quantity. And then double click the final one. This is the total. Okay, so things are starting to take a little bit more shape. What do we need to do next? What other issues do we need to fix? Well, if we take a look at the product category column, you can see that we have some weird spacing going on in here. We've got some tab spaces in here. Now, if I was working in Excel and I wanted to get rid of all of these spaces, I would use the trim formula. You might be familiar with that. It will just take out all of these spaces. Now, we have the same thing in Power Query. And one thing I always say to people is, don't just trim the column that is very obvious. I always trim all of my columns just to make sure there are no erroneous spaces lurking in there, because spaces can be the devil when you're trying to analyze a data set. So in general, what I'll do is select all of my columns. So I'm just going to hold down Shift to select them all, and then I'll trim the whole lot. Now, you're going to find your trim underneath Transform. In the text column just here, we have a format drop down, and check out what we have in here, because so many of these you might be able to relate to formulas that you've used in Excel previously. So we have lowercase in here. That is the equivalent of the function lower in Excel to change everything to lowercase. This is the equivalent to upper in Excel to change everything to uppercase. Capitalize each word is the equivalent to the proper function in Excel, where we just have the first letter of each word capitalized. We then have trim and clean. Again, two functions you may have used in Excel. So we're going to choose trim, and like magic, it trims out all of those erroneous spaces. So we are definitely looking a lot better now. What else do we need to do here? Well, this column just here, product-category. Now, for some reason, when somebody has put this data set together, they've decided to combine both the product and the category that that product's in the same column. And one rule of data analysis is that make sure that you split up your data. You don't want two separate things in the same column. So really what we want here is we want a column just listing out all of the products, and we want a column that just lists out the categories. Now, because we've combined them here and it's separated with a dash, we're going to need to split up this column. So again, we're just going to go to the Transform tab, Split Column, and we're going to choose by delimiter because I want to split this column where that dash appears. So we're going to say by delimiter. And again, we don't have a dash in here, so you need to choose custom. It's remembered mine from last time where I put a dash in. Click on OK and check it out. We now have product in one column and category in another column. I can then go in and rename these headings. So we're going to say product, and then we're going to say category. We are looking so neat now. If you think about what this data set looked like when we started and what it's looking like now, it's such a huge change. And still, everything I'm doing is being logged in this pane on the right-hand side. Final couple of things. It's always worth going through and checking the data types applied to each column. Now, when I say data types, I mean these little things just here. So can you see next to each of these column headings, we have these little icons. So if we click on the one next to order number, this is where we can see what the data type is for this particular column. And often you'll need to go in and check these and make sure you have the correct one applied, depending on what type of data you have in that column. So for order number, Power Query's picked up that this is text. Now, order numbers are a little bit, sometimes you want to have them as numbers, sometimes you want to keep them as text. I'm just going to keep these as text. But this one just here, order date, I want to switch to date. And you can see that moves it over. Product is text, and that is actually text that we have selected. Category is also text, that's fine. Price per unit, well, this needs to be currency, so let's switch it. Quantity, well, this is a whole number. And then finally, we have total. This is also going to be currency. Okay, so always go through and check to make sure that you have the correct data types applied. So we're looking pretty good. We're almost at the stage where we can load this back into Excel and start our analysis. The final thing I want to show you here is just how you can create custom columns as well. So if you take a look, we have a totals column, and this totals column is basically a calculation. So price per unit multiplied by quantity. So if we didn't have this, I'm going to remove the total column from the data set. Maybe this is what our data set looked like. We've just got price per unit and quantity. We don't actually have a column that shows the total. What we can do is when we're working in Power Query, we can add a custom column that's going to perform that calculation. So if you're familiar with pivot tables, this is very similar to adding a calculated field. So what we could do here, if we wanted to add total column back in, is go up to the Add Column tab, and in the General group, we can create ourselves a custom column. So we can give our new column a name. I'm going to call it total. And the way this works is you can't actually type a formula into here. You have to use the column names. So I want to do basically price per unit multiplied by quantity. So I can use the column names to do that. So we're going to double click on price per unit. We're going to put in an asterisk, which means multiply by quantity. Notice at the bottom it says no syntax errors have been detected, so I know that this formula is valid. And then when I click on OK, it's basically going to add that column for me with that calculation in it. And of course, I now have to go back in and set the data type to currency. Okay, so just be aware that you can do things like that. There's obviously so much more you can do with Power Query than what I'm showing you here when it comes to cleaning and doing different things. But these are some of the main things that you're going to come across. So we have a clean data set now, and we are pretty much ready to load this back into Excel and start our data analysis. So once we've tidied it all up, we're going to go to the Home tab. Notice that the first group just here is close, and we're going to say close and load to. Now at this stage, you can choose what you want to load it into. So you could choose to load it into a table, or you could choose to load it directly into a pivot table or into a pivot chart. So if you just want a table, that's fine. We're going to create a pivot table right off the bat. So let's go to pivot table reports. I'm going to put the pivot table on an existing worksheet, and let's just put it in cell B3. Click on OK. So now it's creating a connection to that data. I've got my blank pivot table report, and I have my pivot table fields over on the right-hand side. And I can now work with this like a regular pivot table. So let's just do a very, very quick and small analysis. I'm going to let's grab category and drop that down into rows. And let's grab total and drop that down into values. And I'm going to do a little bit of formatting here. Let's change the number formats. Let's make those currency and take the decimal places down. And I'm also going to remove the grand total. So let's go to the Design tab, grand total, off for rows and columns. So I have my little data set just here. And I'm going to create a very quick pivot chart. So I'm going to go to Insert. Let's go. And I think we're just going to choose the clustered column chart. That is fine. So if you're used to working with pivot tables and pivot charts, you'll be familiar with this process. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of formatting to this chart, not too much. I'm going to remove all of these grey buttons. So let's say hide all field buttons on chart. And I'm going to remove anything that isn't really serving too much of a purpose here. So I don't really need total in the legend. Let's just delete that out. I'm going to give my chart a title. Let's double click up here. What are we showing? This is total by category. And I'm going to right click and format this data series and just change the gap width on these. And I'm going to add some data labels as well, like so. And I think also if we select the data labels, I am going to remove the dollar formatting so we can expand number. And I'm just going to change these to number and take the decimal places down to 0 to format those labels. Notice that the labels are now formatted differently from the table. So don't forget, you can do things like that when you're working in pivot charts. You can apply different formatting, even if it's different in the table. So now I have my data labels. I'm just going to delete out the vertical axes because I don't really need that once I have these values at the top. So when you're working with charts, it's always good to try and make them as clean looking as possible and remove anything unnecessary. Final thing I'm going to do, because this blue, I don't know why it's annoying me, let's change this to a nice bright purple color. Right, so now we have our pivot table and we have our little pivot chart. I just want to show you what happens when something changes, how quickly this will all refresh. And I'm just going to go back to the original file. So Faker Holdings Limited. Now imagine that it's the next week and you've downloaded the new file from the external system and you've put it into this folder. Maybe you've overwritten the current file that's in there with the updated one. What you can then do is simply refresh all of your Excel data and it will pull through all of the new information. You're not going to have to go through and rerun all of the cleaning processes again, okay? Because it's going to remember what you did and apply it to any new data that's added into this folder. Now, just to cheat this a little bit, because I don't have a file to drop in, I'm just going to open this one and I'm going to change one of the categories. And just to make it different from what we currently have in this Excel spreadsheet. So let's just pretend that I'm just going to change this to the category beauty. Okay, and let's make this different as well. Let's make that 400 so it's more obvious. I'm just going to do file and save. So effectively, the file that we've just used to build this pivot table and this pivot chart, that file is now different to the one that's currently sitting in the folder, which is this one here, and linked to this workbook. So if I want to pull through that new data, all I need to do is click on refresh. It's going to run all of our cleaning steps that we ran in Power Query to clean up any data that's been added, and all of these are going to update. So if you keep your eye on the pivot table or the pivot chart, you should find that a new category called beauty is added into here as soon as we refresh. So I'm going to right click on refresh. There it is. Beauty is added on the bottom, and it's also been added to the chart. That is all we would need to do each week. Every time a new file was put into that folder, we would simply right click, refresh, and it's going to pull it all through. We don't have to clean that data every single week.
A big congratulations, everyone, for making it all the way to the end of this course. So it's just about time for me to sign off and say goodbye to you all. I hope you enjoyed running through this course as much as I've enjoyed teaching it to you. Once again, my name is Deb. Bye for now.
Hi, from everyone at Simon Says It. We hope you're enjoying this training lesson. Please like this video to show your support for the channel. If you want to take your learning further, earn a certificate for this course, and gain access to over 200 courses ad-free, click up there and go to simonsaysit.com. Thanks for watching, and back to the course.
This is probably my favorite subject in Excel. I love training pivot tables. It is one of the best things in Excel, according to me, particularly if your job involves a lot of data analysis. And I think these days, most of us have some kind of data analysis part to the jobs that we do. We have a lot of data and we need to make sense of it. And really, pivot tables are the #1 tool in Excel for analyzing your data. My name is Deborah Ashby, and I'm a Microsoft IT trainer. I've been a trainer for about 16 years now, and I've worked in the wider IT industry for about 27 years. So I've pretty much seen Excel evolve from a fairly basic application in the 1990s to the very complex product that it is today. You may have come across pivot tables before. You might even have been asked to put a pivot table together. And if you've never done one before, then it isn't particularly obvious how you would put one together or even why they can be useful. And I will say that with pivot tables, as I mentioned, they are brilliant if you would need to analyze a large data set. We use pivot tables when we want to extract meaning from our numbers. So by looking at just the data in the spreadsheet, it's very hard for us to maybe say how many sales per company we've got without maybe doing a formula or using a pivot table. And by far, pivot tables are my preferred method as opposed to using formulas. They're just a lot more flexible and dynamic. And we use pivot tables to really organize our data and present data so that it's easy for other people to interpret, so people can see exactly what it is that they're interested in. And leading on from that, once we've created our pivot table to analyze our data, we can then make it even easier for people, and we can make it really visual by displaying that pivot table data in a pivot chart. And then if you want to really take it on a stage further, we can start doing things like creating interactive dashboards to display key metrics. We've basically just discussed what pivot tables are and why they're useful. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to open that data set, because I just want you to understand what you're looking at before we actually get into analyzing it. I find people often miss out that step and they just present data. And if it's the first time that you're seeing it, it can be a bit sort of confusing and all over the place. So we'll go through each of the columns so we understand. We're then going to talk a little bit about the importance of Excel tables. Now, Excel tables are different to pivot tables. The main reason being that Excel tables are more static than a pivot table. A pivot table is something we can move around and analyze in different ways, whereas an Excel table is basically a table. But they are one of the most useful things in Excel, and I always use them if I'm going to create a pivot table. So we'll talk a bit about tables. We'll then create our first pivot table, very exciting. And then I'll show you the most important part, which is how you can pivot the fields around, move things around, so you can just analyze your data in lots of different ways in about 2 seconds. So it's very, very simple. We're going to talk a little bit about grouping while we're going through pivoting the fields. I'm just going to show you some other things that you can do with pivot tables, basically. So some of the most important things that you might want to do, how we can aggregate our data or change the way that we're aggregating our data, whether we're summing or counting or working out the average, things like that. I'm going to show you how you can show values as something else, so maybe a percentage of the total, things like that. We're going to take a look at how we can apply number formatting in pivot tables, because it does differ a little bit than when you're just applying number formatting to regular cells in Excel. So I'll show you that. I'm going to show you how you can toggle on subtotals and grand totals, change the report layout, how we can jazz up our pivot table, add a bit of color and apply a pivot table style. And then we'll move on to the section about creating pivot charts. So we're going to take our pivot table data and we're going to put it into a really nice visual chart. I'll show you a little bit about some of the things you can do to format your pivot charts and just make them a little bit easier to read and just look a bit nicer, I guess. And then we're going to add some interactivity by adding something called slicers. If you've never come across slicers before, they're a really wonderful way of making it super easy for anybody who's looking at your data to interact with that data without messing up what you've already done. And then finally at the end, a really important part, I'm going to show you how you can very quickly update all of your pivot tables and all of your pivot charts with the click of one button. So let's get going. Notice at the bottom, I have 2 tabs. I have one called Store Data that I'm currently on. I have another one called July Data. Now, don't worry about the July Data tab too much at the moment. We're going to use this at the end when we update our data. Our main focus at the moment is going to be on this tab, the Store Data tab. So let's just take a moment just to look at our data and understand exactly what we're looking at here. So basic generic sales data, we have the date in column A, and I've basically set to take a reading on the 1st of every month, and the data is about 6 months worth of data. We then have the store in column B. So this is data for 2 different stores, Computech and Microworld. We then have the town that store is located in. These are towns in the UK. We have a store code. We have the country. We have the manager of the store. We have the category that item belongs to. So you can see here, these are electrical stores. They're selling electrical goods. And then the amount of sales. So this is the data we're going to be analyzing. Now, if you want to quickly see how many lines of data, if we press the shortcut key, Control down arrow on our keyboard, that's going to jump us all the way down to the last row of our data. So we can see here that this is a reasonably large data set. We have 21,576 rows of data. And you can see there with the date, it goes to June 2019. So I have 6 months worth of data here. Control up arrow to jump me back up to the first row in the table. Now, my data has column headings. This is everything that we have here in row 1. And I would advise you, if you're going to use pivot tables, you need to have column headings in your data. Very important. Otherwise, things just get extremely confusing. Now, the data set that we're using here is what we call a clean data set. And what I mean by that is that I've already tidied it up. I've applied formatting where necessary. I've removed duplicates. I've removed blank rows. Anything that looked slightly strange, I've removed out of this data already. Now, the first thing I always do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is before I put my data into a pivot table, I always make sure that I format my raw data set as an Excel table, which is different to a pivot table. The reason being that Excel tables have the ability to auto expand. So if I was to add any more data onto the bottom of this data set, it's going to essentially become part of the Excel table, which makes updating all of the pivot tables a lot easier later on. So you'll see exactly what I mean by that when we get to that section. But for the time being, just remember, put your data in a table. You won't regret it. So to quickly put our data in a table, all we need to do here is click anywhere within our data and press the keyboard shortcut Control-T. That's the shortcut for creating a table. Alternatively, if you don't particularly like keyboard shortcuts, you could go to the Home tab and click the Format as Table button over here in the Styles drop-down. So I've just taken this out of the table in case you didn't see that process. Control-T to put our data into an Excel table. Yes, my table has headers. Let's click on OK. So now we have our table design contextual ribbon at the top, and I always recommend that you give your table a name. It just makes it a lot more meaningful. So in the first group here where we have properties, I'm going to call this sales data. And it's worth noting that with these table names, if you've got two words like I have just here, you need to make them all one word, or you need to separate the words with an underscore. You can't have any spaces in your table names. So we have our table named. We're now ready to create our pivot table. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can do it from the insert ribbon. We have a pivot table button just here, but I generally tend to find that I'm normally already on the table design ribbon. And because I'm already on this ribbon, I might as well use one of the options that we have, which is this one, Summarize with Pivot Table. So let's click on this. You can see here it says select the table or range. So it's picked up the data that I want to use, basically all of the data around where I'm clicked, and I can see my table name in here. I can then choose where I need to place this pivot table. So do I want to place it on a new worksheet, an existing worksheet, or do I want to add it to the data model? Now in this lesson, we're going to put our pivot table on a new worksheet, and I highly recommend you put pivot tables on new worksheets separate to your raw data. So let's click on OK. Now notice at the bottom here, we have a new worksheet. It's called Sheet 2 at the moment. We are going to rename it. And we're currently looking at a blank pivot table report. And then over on the right-hand side, now I'm just going to rearrange this because this isn't how it will look when you go to it. It will look like this, okay? This is our pivot table fields pane. Now, notice what we have in here. If we take a look in this top area, we have all of the column headings from our raw data sets. We have date, store, town, store codes, so on and so forth. So that is why it's so important to let the pivot table know that your data contains column headings, because it's going to pull those in and use them as pivot table fields. And that's the terminology when we're working with pivot tables. These are referred to as fields. Underneath, we have 4 currently blank areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And basically, all we do to create our pivot table is we drag and drop different fields into different areas underneath to build our pivot table report. And it's really worth knowing, or it's really worth looking at your data and thinking about what exactly it is that you want to extract from your data. What are you interested in? So maybe your manager has come to you and he wants you to pull out from this data how many sales have been generated for Computech, or how many sales have been generated by a specific manager. So working out exactly what you're interested in is really going to help you when it comes to how you organize your fields. Now, as I mentioned, this is sort of the standard way that your pivot table fields and your little filter areas down here are displayed. But I know that some people prefer to display them side by side. So you can see we have a little cog icon just here. If I click the drop down, we can change it to fields, sections, and areas sections side by side. So let's click this. And it just displays them in a slightly different way. Some people find this easier, but it is entirely up to you. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here, we'll start off with something really basic. So we are going to analyze this data, and what we want to pull out of it is just the total amount of sales per store. So remember, we only have 2 stores, Computech and Microworld. So let's start arranging our fields. So I'm going to grab the store field and I'm just going to drag and drop it into this rows area. Now, when I let go, check out the pivot table report. It now puts both of those stores into the rows. And because I want to see the amount of sales, I'm going to grab the sales field and we're going to drag that down into the values area. Would you take a look at that? Within 2 seconds, I can basically tell my manager exactly how many sales we've generated for Computech. If I wanted to go a stage further and maybe wanted to remove Microworld from this, I could use the little filter drop down and just select Computech to see just that information that's of interest to me. So really nice and straightforward. That is a basic pivot table, okay? Really easy. We're just dragging and dropping fields. Now, what about if we take this store field that we currently have in rows and drag and drop it into columns instead? What does that do to our report? Well, it just organizes it in a slightly different way. We now have the stores running down in the columns. So we have sum of sales and we can still see the information. And then we have the grand total at the end. So this is what we call pivoting the fields. It's basically just moving fields around to different areas to perform different types of analysis. Let's do another type of analysis. Maybe I now want to see which manager is performing the best and generating the most sales. So this time I don't really need the store information, so I can get rid of this field. And to remove a field from any of these areas, you simply drag it outside until you see that red cross and let go. I can now add the manager field instead, and I'm going to drop that into rows. So now take a look at my report. I have all of the managers listed here, and I have how many sales in monetary value, not the count, how many sales they've generated. If I was to drag manager into columns, again, it just displays that in a different way. And for this type of information, that's not particularly useful. I would definitely have that in rows as opposed to columns. Let's do another type of analysis. Let's drag manager outside again. Now, this time I'm going to drag town into the rows area. So now I can see the amount of sales generated by each town in the UK. So this is doing a very basic analysis, but this is a pivot table. Okay, that is pretty much all there is to it. Obviously, we're going to get a little bit more complex, but at its very basic level, you've created yourself a pivot table to extract data. Let's take it up a notch, because so far we've just been adding one field into each of these. Let me show you what happens when you start adding multiple fields. So I'm going to remove the town from the rows. And this time I'm going to let's drag the category into rows. I'm also going to grab the manager and drag that into rows as well, but I'm going to place it underneath category. When I let go, take a look at the analysis. We can now see our data broken down by category and manager. So I have the category at the top, then the manager, and I can see how many sales they've generated. We then have the next category, then all the managers and the sales for that category. All right, so it's a different type of analysis. And when we have it in this layout, we can actually see the subtotals at the top here. So the subtotal for the cameras category is this number just here. Now, I'm somebody who doesn't like to read subtotals at the top. I very much like to have subtotals at the bottom. And I'm going to show you in a moment how you can simply move this subtotal down if you prefer it to look that way. We'll do that in a moment. Now, what about if I go back to this rows area and I rearrange these so that manager is above category? Let's just drag it above, let go. I now have it organized by manager, then the category underneath. So just different ways that we can look at this data simply by pivoting these fields and moving them all around. Now, what about this filters area at the top here? We haven't put anything into there so far. What we can do is maybe if I wanted to grab the store field, I can grab it, drop it into filters. And if we take a look at the pivot table report, I now have this filter area at the top. So if I'm only interested in this analysis for Computech, I can select it and it's going to apply a filter. So now I'm just seeing the sum of sales broken down by manager and category for the store Computech. All right, and click the filter again. I can put it back to all, whatever I want to do. Okay, so really nice and straightforward. You can have a lot of fun with this and move things around and get all types of analysis out of your data. Let's do something slightly different now. I'm going to remove the filter, so let's take that out. And I'm going to remove the manager. Let's just leave category and the sum of sales. Now, what about if I want to break this information down by date instead? So I'm going to grab the date and I'm going to drag it into rows and I'm going to place it above category. You can now see it's breaking it down in a slightly different way. Now this looks a little bit weird because all of my data in my raw data set, I took a reading of our sales figures on the 1st of every month. So you can see here it says January and then it says 1 Jan and then 1 Feb, 1 Mar, because that's when I took the reading. So those are all of the dates in my raw data set. Also notice that even though I moved the date field to rows, notice that it's actually split it out into months and date for me. So it's basically looked at my raw data, it's looked at the date column, and it's broken it down in a way that it thinks I might be interested in. Now, in this actual example, this isn't particularly helpful. I know that all of my readings were taken on the 1st of January. I'm not really interested in having 1st of Jan, 1st of Feb in here. I just want it to say Jan, Feb, March. So what I could do then is I could remove the date field out of here, and then it's going to break it down by January, February, March. Okay, so just be aware of that. Sometimes when you are dragging dates into rows or columns, it will look at the date and it will try and break it down for you. Sometimes it will break it down into quarters, sometimes into months. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. So just remove accordingly. Okay, so lots of different ways that you can analyze your data. Now, because we have this ordered by our months and then we have our categories, notice next to the months, we have these little collapsible menus. So I can collapse up January, collapse up February, and I can also expand these out. So those kind of help me really zero in on maybe one particular month that I'm interested in. Now, while we're on the subject, when we're clicked inside a pivot table, as we are now, notice up on the ribbons, we have new contextual ribbons. Pivot Table Analyze, and also the Design ribbon. So everything that we need to format our pivot table, do different things with our pivot table, we're going to find on one of these two ribbons. Now, if we take a look over on the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, all the way over in the Show group, notice that the middle one there, the plus minus buttons, is toggled on. And that's why I can see these collapsible and expandable buttons next to the months. But if I just didn't need those and I wanted to remove them, I could toggle those off and it's going to get rid of them just there. Also, a really important thing to note, because I get this question all the time, is if your field list disappears or if you accidentally close it down, so if I click on the cross and that goes away, people are like, oh, how do I get my field list back? Click in the pivot table analyze, in the show group, field list. Click this, it's going to pop that pane back open. Okay, so lots of little tips and tricks just there. Now I'm going to rearrange my pivot table very slightly. Let's remove the months and I'm going to leave it on just the category and also the sum of sales, because we're going to start to talk about value field settings, how we can aggregate our data in different ways. Now, currently, this pivot table is just showing me the sum of all sales. So it's aggregating the data for all of the cameras that have been sold, all of the memory cards, regardless of where they were sold or anything. So I can see the actual total sales for each of these categories. Now, it might be that I want to see the count or the average or something completely different. So this is where I can go in and change how I'm summarizing or aggregating this data. So by default, it's done a sum, but maybe I want to see a count, the actual number of cameras that have been sold, as opposed to the monetary value. So what we can do here is we can right-click in sum of sales, and we can go down to value field settings. And we can then choose how we want to aggregate this data. So maybe instead of sum, I want to count. I'm going to change it to count of sales, and now I can see the count as opposed to the sum. Another way that we could do this, instead of right-clicking over here, is if we're working in our pivot table fields, where we have the values area, we can click the drop-down and we can access value field settings from there, and I could maybe do an average of all of the sales instead. Okay, so we can aggregate our data in different ways. Now, what if I want to see the sum of all of these sales, but I also want to see the count? How would we do that? Well, I'm going to change this one back to sum so that we have our sum of sales. But what if I want to have another column that shows me the count? Well, this is really simple. All we need to do is grab the sales field again, exactly the same field, and drag and drop it to the values area. It's going to give us another column, and of course by default it's going to do a sum. So we're getting exactly the same data as the previous column. But you might have already worked this out. We can very quickly right click in this column and we can choose to summarize the values by the count instead. So now I have the sum of sales, but I also have the count in the same pivot table. I can then change these headings to make them a little bit more meaningful. So sum of sales is okay. I don't really want this to say count of sales too. I'm going to click in the cell, double click, and we're going to take the 2 off the end just to change the title of that field. Now notice as soon as I did that, the pivot table kind of jumped and rearranged itself. It collapsed up its columns. And you'll notice that if you start doing things like widening columns so that you can see the data a bit better, when you change the fields around, or even if you do a refresh of your pivot table, these are going to jump back to how they were originally. So let me show you a quick example of that. If I go up to refresh, and I'm just going to say refresh all, it's going to jump back to auto width, basically. So the width of the longest item in the cell. So if you have specific widths that you want to keep your pivot table at, you need to make sure that you change that in your pivot table options. And then when you start moving fields around or refreshing pivot tables, the column widths aren't going to change. Sometimes that can be a real pain if you've spent ages making a pivot table look really nice and getting those column widths exactly as you want them. As soon as you change something in the pivot table, it just collapses back up to how it was originally. So to retain these column widths, we need to go to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. We're going to go across to Options. And in here, right towards the bottom, we have an option here, Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. So I want to deselect this because I want to keep it as the column widths that I've set. So let's click on OK. And now if I was to refresh this pivot table, those column widths aren't going to change. Okay, so just a little tip there, which I see very few people point out, and it can be really valuable. Now, another thing that we can do once we've sort of done this summary just here is that we can show our values as something else. So maybe I want to show the sum of sales for each of the categories as a percentage of the grand total. So what I'm going to do is I want this to be in another column. So I'm going to grab another sales field, drag it down to values. Of course, by default, it's going to do a sum of sales too. But straight away, I'm going to right click and we're going to say show values as, and then I have various different options in here. So I want to show my values as a percentage of the grand total. And I'm going to rename this field at the top here to say percentage of grand total, like so. So now I can actually see the actual percentage of total sales that the camera sales make up. Okay, so this is another really nice way that we can analyze it. And we have lots of other things within this show values ad that we can do. So we can show running totals, we can show percentages of the column total, lots of different calculations that we can perform. Okay, so just keep adding sales fields and changing them to show exactly what you're interested in. All right, so really nice and straightforward. We're going to move on to talking about number formatting. So far, we haven't spoken about number formatting. And if you take a look at the sum of sales column in our pivot table, currently our values don't have any formatting. We don't have any commas. We don't have any decimal places. We don't have any currency symbols. Now, the way that you apply number formatting in a pivot table is slightly different to if you're just applying number formatting in an Excel spreadsheet. What we don't do is we don't select our data just here and then go to home and select our number format. We don't do it that way. What we do instead is we click within our data, we right click, we go down to value field settings and we choose number format from here. And then we can go in and choose the formatting that we want. So I'm just going to choose, let's go for currency formatting. I'm going to take the decimal places down to 0 and I'm going to leave it on the dollar symbol. Let's click on OK and OK again, and it's going to apply that number formatting. Okay, so remember to apply it that way as opposed to selecting the cells. The reason why we don't select the cells and apply the number formatting is if those pivot table fields then move, if we rearrange our pivot table fields, the formatting doesn't carry with it. It's applied to the cell. So you're going to get sort of some numbers with formatting and some numbers without. Okay, so that's why we do it in a slightly different way. Let's move on to taking a look at some of the ways that we can change the way that our pivot table report looks. Now for this, I'm going to add in another field. Let's go for manager again. I'm going to drop that into rows. Let's organize it like that. All right, because I want to talk to you about subtotals and grand totals. I briefly touched on this at the beginning of the session. When you have your data organized like this, so multiple fields within rows, you're going to see subtotals at the top by default. Now, if you don't like this, if you're someone who prefers to read your subtotals at the bottom, I am one of those people, then we can change that. And we do this on the design ribbon at the top here. Now, the first group here is the layout group. And we have a subtotals drop down. So we can choose to turn our subtotals off entirely, or we can show them at the bottom or at the top of the group. So I'm going to switch mine to show at the bottom of the group, and I can now see the subtotal for Felicity Chambers. Okay, so this is entirely personal preference. You might prefer them to be at the top, or you might just want to turn them off altogether. Entirely up to you. Now, the same thing applies for your grand totals. You're always going to have, and I have quite a lot of data here, a grand total right at the bottom. So this is just a total of everything in that column of the pivot table. If you like that, you can keep it on. If you want to turn it off, you have various different options here. So you could turn it off for rows and columns, which will turn it off entirely. And I will say that if you do plan on putting your pivot table or putting it into a pivot chart, it's always good to turn off the grand total because you don't really want to include most of the time a grand total in your visual analysis. So I'm going to turn this off for rows and columns, like so. So very, very simple. So by default, I'm showing my pivot table in compact form. But I could choose to show it in outline form, which gives me a slightly different way of viewing it. It puts the manager name into its own separate column as to kind of putting it in the same column as the category. I can change it to tabular form. Again, something very slightly different. You might find this easier to read. Or I can go back to compact form. Now, if I have this in tabular form, I might want to repeat the manager labels all the way down through all of these rows. Sometimes that can be quite helpful. We can choose to repeat all item labels, which is going to put this into each row. Now, for me, that looks a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to remove those item labels and put it back to compact view. But just remember, you've got different layouts for your report. Choose one that's most appropriate for your data. We can even add in blank rows. So if I want to insert a blank line, I can do that. It just gives a little bit of separation between each item in your pivot table. Again, just makes it a bit easier to read. So think about all of those things when you're putting together your pivot table. Now, just a couple of things related to pivot table styles. There's nothing too complex here. Again, if we work up on the design ribbon, we have a big old group here, which opens up a gallery of different types of formatting, different styles that we can apply to our pivot tables. And we can hover over and get a nice live preview as to what each of these look like. So go through these, choose one that appeals to you. I'm just going to choose this one because I really like the color rose. Why not? That will quickly apply to your pivot table. Once you've applied a style, you can then customize that style further by turning on these different pivot table style options. So if I click on banded rows, that's just going to put some lines running across again, which makes this a bit easier to read. I can do various different things. You can see as I toggle this off and on, it removes the formatting from the column header. I can do the same with the row headers, or I can choose to have banded columns, things like that. And these pivot table style options work slightly differently depending on which style you've selected. So it's always worth selecting a style, having a play around with these until you get your pivot table into a really nice, easy to read format. Now, one thing I would say is that if you are going to be creating lots of different types of analysis, so maybe you want to do what we've done here, so we're summarizing by manager and category, but maybe then you want to just see a breakdown of the sales by the store. You might want to create multiple different pivot tables. Now, the easiest way to do that for me is to simply copy the current pivot table. And when I say copy, I just mean copy the entire worksheet. Now, before we do that, I'm going to rename this worksheet so that it accurately represents what's on this worksheet. So let's right click, let's rename it. And I always name my worksheets, if they contain a pivot table, PVT. That's my standard naming convention. And then what is this showing? Well, this is a summary by manager and category. So I'm just going to say man _ cat. I have an idea as to what this pivot table represents. Now, if I wanted to do another pivot table, all I would do is copy the entire worksheet. And you can do that very quickly by holding down Control and then just dragging and dropping the tab. It's going to create a copy. We're going to have the pivot table on here, and we can then rearrange this pivot table to show what we want in the second analysis. So maybe I just want to analyze by store on this particular pivot table. And maybe I want to turn on grand totals for this particular one. Like so. Maybe I want to change the style of this pivot table. I can do that. So now very quickly, I've managed to create two different types of analysis using the same pivot table. I haven't had to go back to the raw data and start all over again. I then simply right click and rename this tab. This one might be called pivot _ store _ sales, something like that. And I would carry on duplicating for as many analyses as I need to do. So that's a nice little quick trick for creating multiple pivot tables. When we use a chart, we're just basically visually interpreting the data that we have in the pivot table. And a lot of people find a chart a lot easier to read than maybe just simply looking at data. Charts are particularly good if you're trying to compare different items. It's a lot easier to see if it's in a chart. Now, I will say that when it comes to creating a pivot chart, you really need to take a good look at the data that you have in your pivot table and think about what type of chart is going to suit your data best, because not all charts are created equally. And I'm going to show you an example of this. I'm just going to rearrange these fields a little bit just to demonstrate this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove category so that we just have a list of the managers and their sum of sales. So if I wanted to put this data into a pivot chart, what I could do is go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and over in the Tools group, I have a Pivot Chart button. Now, if I click on Pivot Chart, it's going to allow me to select all different kinds of charts, and they're organized down into different categories. Now, maybe I decide that I really like pie charts. I don't, for the record, but maybe I decide today I want to put this data in a pie chart. So I'm going to select the pie chart, click on OK. And I've got a bit too much data for this pie chart. It's not particularly easy to see. And because all of these sales are reasonably close together, it's very hard for me to see just by looking at the pie chart exactly sort of who's generated the most sales. It's not a particularly good analysis using a chart. And because I have quite a few different managers, I have to make this chart quite big in order to be able to see them all in this legend. So this is a particularly good chart for the type of data that I want to analyze. So think about that. In general, the general rule that I tend to live by is things like column charts and bar charts are pretty much universal. They're pretty good at representing any type of data. Whereas if you have maybe time-based data, so maybe we had sales over January to December, those are always nicely represented using things like line charts. I would only ever use a pie chart, and I very rarely use pie charts for very, very small amounts of data. So maybe if I just wanted to show the amount of sales by store, because I only have 2 stores, a pie chart would be quite a nice chart to use to represent that data. So really think about the chart type that you're using before you put together your chart. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a very basic bar chart. I'm going to select bar. We're just going to use the basic bar chart just here and click on OK. And that's going to give me my pivot chart. Now, again, I have quite a bit of information on here. And what I would say is that when you're trying to visually represent data, don't try to cram as much information into your chart as possible. For example, if I wanted to show this to maybe my CEO or maybe some key stakeholders, maybe they're not interested in seeing all of the managers and how many sales they've generated. Maybe they only really want to see the top 5 managers. So that would be a much better data set to represent in a chart because it's a lot smaller and it's a lot easier to compare. And we're really honing in on what we want to see. So what I would do here is I would go to my pivot table, click where we have row labels, and I'm going to apply a filter. And I'm going to apply a top 10 filter. And I'm going to say, only show me the top 5 items by sum of sales. And items in this case is going to be the managers. So when I click on this, I now see who the top managers were. If I want to sort these, I can do that from here as well. If I click the drop down, I can sort A to Z or Z to A. I actually don't want to do that. I want to right click and I want to sort smallest to largest or largest to smallest. So if I want to see the top selling manager at the top, I can do largest to smallest and I can see that Spencer Lee has generated the most sales. And this is a much nicer data set to show in a pivot chart. Another thing when it comes to pivot charts is you want to make them as clean looking as possible. You don't want loads of things on your pivot chart that aren't necessary, okay? The simpler, the better when it comes to pivot charts. So the first thing I always do when I've created a pivot chart is I come in and I remove any unwanted items. So these little grey buttons here, these are little filters. We can filter our pivot chart, but I actually prefer to do my filtering in the pivot table, which will in turn update the pivot chart. So I'm going to remove these grey buttons simply by right-clicking and saying hide all field buttons on chart. I'm then going to click up in the chart title and I'm going to give my chart a name so everybody knows what this represents. So this is showing the top 5 managers by sales. Okay, very, very simple. Other things that we can do here, we have a little legend. Now, sometimes the legend is really useful. It shows you, what each bar represents on the chart. In this case, it just says total, not particularly useful at all. So we can get rid of the legend in a few different ways. It is just a text box. I can select it and just press the delete key. Alternatively, if I click the plus icon just here, I can turn off and on different elements of my chart. So I could deselect legend and that's going to remove it. Sometimes I like to add data labels as opposed to having this horizontal axis at the bottom. So again, if we click on the plus next to the chart, I can add data labels. And if I click the arrow, I'm going to display them on the inside end of the bar. I can then select those data labels and apply formatting. So if I want to change the color, maybe I want to make them white, I can simply go to the home ribbon and make those changes. I'm just going to make these bold so they stand out a bit. So if I have data labels on each bar like that, it really means that I don't need this horizontal axis. I can then just simply select it and delete it out, making my chart look a lot cleaner. Maybe I want to make these bars a little bit wider or a little bit narrower. How do we do that? Well, this time we need to right click and we can say Format Data Series. And this allows us to change the gap width, so I can make the bars wider or thinner. And there's loads and loads of different formatting options that we have in this right-click menu. And you'll find that with your charts, wherever you're clicked, for example, if I click on this axis just here, if I right-click, I can go in and I have loads of different options in this pane for formatting this axis in different ways. So don't forget, when it comes to adding items to your charts, you've got the little plus icon just here. You can click on the element and you've got some right-click menus, and you also have some contextual ribbons, Pivot Chart Analyze at the top, Design and Format. So many different options. I could select my bars, go up to the Format tab, and I could do things like maybe say, I don't want to fill, but maybe I just want a nice outline around the outside. And I'm going to change the weight of that outline to something like that. Now, in this case, that doesn't look particularly great, but hopefully you get the idea. I can remove the grid lines, select them, press delete, makes it look even cleaner. Now, this looks too hideous for me. I need to fill that with something just to feel okay with myself. There we go. That's a bit better. Now, one thing you might also have noticed is that when you create a bar chart, because we've sorted this, notice that the chart shows the actual managers in a different order to what we have in the pivot table. It kind of reverses them in the pivot chart. But what we can do is click on the axes, right click and say Format Axes. And in here, right at the bottom, we can choose to show the categories in reverse order. And that just makes them match up with what we have in the pivot table. The next thing I want to show you is just how you can very simply add interaction into your pivot tables and pivot charts using slicers. And a slicer is basically just a visual filter. So what we can do is we can click on the pivot chart or the pivot table, go up to the Analyze ribbon, and in the filter group here, we can choose to insert a slicer. And we can insert slicers for any column heading that we have in our data. So maybe I want to insert a slicer for, let's say, the store and the town. Click on OK. And it's going to give me these little visual panes that I can put somewhere on my worksheet. And I will say that if you're doing this, you probably want to leave a bit of room, maybe in the column A, to place these slicers. I'm just going to put mine over here. I'm going to resize this one. I'm going to put this one underneath. And I've got loads of towns, so I'm not going to be able to fit them all into this slicer in a nice fashion, but we can scroll through and see them all. Now, these are linked to our pivot charts and our pivot tables. So if I want to filter all of this data and just see the information for Computech, I can simply click on the slicer and it's going to update. I've got a little clear filter button at the top here. I can click on something else. So maybe I want to see the analysis for the store microworld for, let's say, the town Bath, and I can hold down Control and select more than one, 3 different towns like that. So this is a really nice interactive way. So if you send this to other people who aren't particularly familiar with Excel, this makes it really nice and easy for them to filter the data and extract out of it what they're interested in a really nice and visual way. Let's click on the cross and click on the cross again. The final thing to show you is simply how we can update all of our pivot table data with the click of one button. So if we go back to our store data, as I mentioned, this store data runs to June 2019. Now, this is sales data. So it means that in the month of July, on July the 1st, I'm going to have another bunch of data to add into my data set. And what I've done is I've just put that data on the July data tab. Now, because we put our original data in a table, this is going to be so simple. All we need to do is take our new data and select it all. A quick way to do that is to click inside, Control A to select everything. And we're going to do a copy and a paste. Control C to copy. Let's go back to our store data, click in the last row, Control V to paste that in. Now you might find that you've got your column headings in there. We can simply delete out that row, but effectively this data has become part of the current Excel table. And what that means is that because it is part of the sales data table and all of the pivot tables and pivot charts that we've built are based off of the table name sales data, all we need to do is refresh the pivot table and it will pull through that new data and update the pivot table and the pivot chart. How do we refresh? Well, we click in the pivot table, we go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and we have a refresh button just here. And if I click on Refresh All, hopefully you saw those numbers changed and the pivot chart updated to reflect that new data as well. Now, if we hadn't put our data into an Excel table, it wouldn't do that. We wouldn't be able to click refresh. We would have to go in and reselect the entire data range, which is a bit of a pain. And that is why it's so important to put your data set inside an Excel table prior to creating your pivot tables. A big congratulations, everyone, for making it all the way to the end of this course. So it's just about time for me to sign off and say goodbye to you all. I hope you enjoyed running through this course as much as I've enjoyed teaching it to you. Once again, my name is Deb. Bye for now.
Hi, from everyone at Simon Says It. We hope you're enjoying this training lesson. Please like this video to show your support for the channel. If you want to take your learning further, earn a certificate for this course, and gain access to over 200 courses ad-free, click up there and go to simonsaysit.com. Thanks for watching, and back to the course.
All right, everybody, welcome. I hope you're having a great evening, morning, wherever you're joining us from today. It's absolutely freezing in the UK today. I am absolutely cold as anything sitting here. So hopefully my hands don't freeze as we're going through this session today. Welcome to everybody who normally joins our webinars. If you're new today, then I will just very briefly introduce myself. So my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm an IT trainer specializing in Microsoft products. And I basically design, deliver and facilitate Microsoft courses both online and in the classroom. And I've been doing this for a very long time, and a large percentage of my time is spent running training on Excel. And I will say that one thing that I've definitely noticed over the last few years is the rise in popularity of analyzing data, extracting data, and presenting key metrics, highlighting pain points in a much more visual way than we ever have done before. So we present our data using charts, using color, so that we can really get across the story of our data. Now, if you are somebody who does that type of thing for a job, then you might be aware of a little application called Power BI. It's definitely the latest buzzword, the application that everybody who analyzes data is kind of using. If you've never heard of Power BI before, it might be because it does kind of live outside of the Microsoft 365 family. So it's not part of your Microsoft 365 subscription if you have one. It is a product that you have to pay for. And it's basically an application that allows you to create really nice looking reports and dashboards and visualizations. But as I said, Power BI is an additional cost. So a lot of people still prefer to create their dashboards in Excel. And there's a few reasons for that, not only the cost. Excel is a familiar application for most people. Most of us use Excel or have used Excel at some point or another. So a lot of people feel a lot more comfortable using Excel when they're first learning how to do dashboards. And for me personally, I find Excel a little bit more flexible than Power BI, particularly when it comes to dashboard design and getting my dashboard to kind of look exactly as I want it to look. So there are pros and cons to both. We're going to focus on dashboards in Excel today. And we're going to walk through the process of building a reasonably straightforward dashboard. And the only reason we're doing a simple dashboard is due to time constraints. I can't show you anything too complex with the time that we have here, but hopefully you're going to see enough that will give you an idea as to what a dashboard is, the potential that it has, and just really spark your interest and get you wanting to learn more about dashboards. So let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. So as I mentioned, we're going to go through a little bit about what exactly is a dashboard, why is it going to be useful, and the best way to illustrate that really is to just show you a completed dashboard example. So we're going to start straight off the bat by showing you a completed version. Please don't judge my design skills, that's all I'll say. We'll then run through some data preparation and organization tips. So this is just going to help you be a little bit more organized, because dashboards can get really complex and you might find yourself with lots and lots of different tabs. So we want to try and organize that as best as we can. I'm then going to go through creating a wireframe. Now, this isn't something that is essential, but it is a good idea to kind of have a plan as to what you want to go onto your dashboard before you even begin. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to jump into actually setting up or creating the information that we want to put on our dashboard. And the dashboard we're going to create today is pretty heavy on pivot tables and charts. So if you love pivot tables as much as I do, then you're probably going to really, really enjoy this. We're going to create 4 different pivot tables and 4 different pivot charts. We're going to create ourselves a line chart, a map chart, a bar chart, and a donut chart. I'm also going to show you how you can incorporate calculations using formulas onto your dashboard as well. So you can sort of really see the potential and the flexibility that you have when you're creating dashboards in Excel. We're then going to go through and we're going to bring it all together. We're going to assemble our dashboard, and then we're going to go through some basic formatting. That's a step that in the real world, formatting your dashboard is very important. You want it to look really nice, really modern, really slick. I don't have a great deal of time, so I'm not going to be making this look amazing. We're just going to be doing some basic formatting. I'm going to show you how you can add interactivity to your to your dashboard using slicers. And then the final thing I'm going to show you is how you can update everything on your dashboard with the click of one button. So that is pretty much all we're going to have time to go through today. So let's get started. So a dashboard is really just kind of a report that helps you display important data or information in a single place so that your audience can easily see key metrics or statistics that are important to them. And that's one thing that is really important. When you're designing dashboards, you need to think to yourself, what questions am I trying to answer with this dashboard? What do people want to know? What does my audience want to know? So we're going to build like a sales dashboard. And this is built off of downloaded sales data. So if I'm presenting these key metrics to maybe my team leader, what's of most interest to them? What do they want to know from this dashboard? And you can see here, this is a completed version of the dashboard that we're going to build today. I am going to change it very slightly because I really don't like the formatting on some of this. So we'll do it slightly different, but this is sort of roughly what we're going to do. And let's just run through it very quickly so you know exactly what you're looking at. So at the top here, we just have a title. And then you can see that we have these sort of key statistics running across the top in pink. So things like the most profitable item, the most profitable region, the number of cancelled orders, and the top sales channel as well. And all of these results underneath, where we have cosmetics, sub-Saharan Africa, so on and so forth, these are all linked back to our original data, so that when the data changes, these will also update accordingly. So I'm going to show you how you can build that type of thing into your dashboard. And then underneath that, we really just have 4 different pivot charts. And I built these in slightly different ways. You can have much more than that on a dashboard, not necessarily just pivot tables or pivot charts. You can do whatever you like on your dashboard. And one thing I would say is if you are sort of fairly new to dashboard design, it's always good to sort of go away and take a look at what other people are doing. And one source that I always go to if I'm thinking, how do I design this dashboard, or I'm trying to give myself some inspiration, I always jump onto sites like Pinterest. So if we go to Pinterest, I've got it open over here, and just type in Excel dashboard design, you can see that you're just going to get tons of these come up, which can give you a really good idea as to how you might want to structure your dashboard. So you can see here we have just an example of a financial dashboard that someone's created. We've got the KPIs listed down the side, and then we have a whole bunch of charts showing different important key metrics. So it's always worth having a look through sites like Pinterest just to give yourself some inspiration. So, saying all of that, what else do we need to be aware of on here? Well, as I said, all of this is built from one data set. And that data set is this tab down here, sales data. Now, this is just a data set that I've downloaded from online. And it's just pure sales data. We have regions, countries, we have the item type that's being sold, the sales channel, whether it's offline or online, priority, and then we have some dates and we have some values. So things like units sold, total revenue, total profit, so on and so forth. So this is a really good meaty data set. We have about 5,000 rows of data. So if I jump to the bottom, control down arrow, first little shortcut key just there, you can see 5001. If we account for the heading, that's 5,000 rows of data. So this is a fairly sizable data set that we're going to use to build this dashboard. Now, one thing that you should be aware of, first of all, is that I've already sort of skipped ahead a little bit because this data set is already nice and tidy. It's nice and consistent. And a lot of the time, depending on where you're getting your data from, you might be downloading it from a third-party system, maybe you're bringing it in from a website. Data doesn't always come across in the perfect format. So we might have to go through and utilize Excel functions to clean it up a little bit. Now, I'm not going to go through any of the cleaning data stuff in this particular session because we did do the webinar on cleaning data, I think either last month or the month before. So if you want to know some of those cleaning data techniques, you can always go back on the Simon Says It website and take a look at that webinar. So our data is already clean. It's already ready for us to analyze. And I've already put it in a table. And this is a really important point. If you want your dashboard to update with the click of one button, you want to make sure that you put your source data in a table. Now, mine's already in a table. How do I know that? Well, I can see that if I take a look at my ribbons, I can see the table design ribbon. So that tells me that my data is in a table. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be able to see that ribbon. So make sure that your data is in a table. If you're not sure how to do that, you can simply click somewhere in your data and press Control T on your keyboard. Mine won't do it because it's already in a table. Control T is the keyboard shortcut to put it into a table. Now, another thing that's really important when you're working with things like this is to make sure that you name your table. And this brings me on to my first sort of talking point, really, which is about standardizing your naming conventions when you're working in Excel. And this really just ties into being a lot more organized than you might normally be. For example, I'm clicked in my table of data. If I take a look up on that table design ribbon, can you see the first group where we have properties? I have table name, and then I've named my table TBL _ sales _ data. So just by looking at this table name, I know that it's a table because it says TBL, and I know it's related to sales data. And you'll see that whenever I name a table in Excel, I always start with TBL so that I know that it's a table. If I have a chart, I might name the chart CHT and then a name. If it's a pivot table, I might name it PVT and then the name. Now, the reason why it's so important to have like a standard naming convention so it's easy to identify the different elements in your dashboard is because it's going to make your life a lot easier when we start having to link our tables and our charts to things like slices. It's going to be easier for you to identify them. So it's good to get into the habit of naming everything correctly as we start to go through. Now, what else do I want to highlight before we actually get into building our dashboard? We're going to talk about wireframes in a moment. So yes, let's talk about that now. I've got a tab at the bottom called wireframe. Now, this might look a little bit strange, but bear with me on this one. Because you have to think to yourself, okay, how am I going to design my dashboard? So before you even begin, you want to make sure that you make a note of exactly what you want to display on that dashboard. Maybe I want to see the average gross sales by country. Maybe I want to see how much profit we've made each month. Maybe I want to see our sales broken down by products so that we can see which are the best performing products and which are the worst, which is going to allow us to make informed decisions when it comes to which products we're selling next year. So sit down and think about the metrics that you actually want to display on the dashboard first of all. Once you have that, start to think about how you want to lay out your dashboard. Where do you want things to go? Where do you want your charts to go? Where do you want your slices to go? Which parts do you want formatted? Things like that. Now, you can do this very quickly just by doing it on a piece of paper. I tend to like to do it in a tab in Excel like I've done here. So I've just used shapes to basically sketch out a plan of how my dashboard is going to look when I start to add my charts and other things in. So I've got my header at the top. I'm going to have some summary statistics at the top. I'm going to have my slices next, and then I've got different spaces for the different charts that we're going to use. So think about that when you're designing your dashboard, or think about it before you start to design it so that you can design it in the best way possible. Okay, so we call that a wireframe. It's really just planning out how your dashboard is going to look. Another thing that you might want to think about when we are starting to think about our dashboard is the use of color in your dashboard. Now, again, as I said, don't judge me on my design just here. I'm not saying that this is a great design or anything. It's something I whipped up very quickly. I'm sure you can put together something that looks a lot nicer than this. But also make sure that if you work for a company who maybe has branded colors, make sure that you're using your theme colors in your dashboard so that everything ties into your company branding. And again, you might have those set up automatically by your IT team when you open up Excel at your workplace, or you might have to create your own themes in Excel. Those are outside of the scope of today's session, but it's just something else to be aware of, the use of color in your spreadsheets. Now, just on that same topic, also notice the way that I've used color to kind of separate different groups of things in this workbook. So if you look at the bottom, if you look at my tabs, can you see that the first two tabs there are colored in this dark pink? So this is basically my data tabs. So I have my sales data on this tab, and then I have some extra data on the next tab. I've then got my wireframe, that's a different color. And then I have these other tabs that are all in blue because they're all kind of the same thing. Each one of these tabs has on it one of the charts that I've used on the dashboard. So I can see all of those on individual worksheets. We then have our calculations tab. I'm going to talk you through this in a moment. And then finally, we have our dashboard. So I've separated everything out and I've used color to make it easier and easier for me to organize all of these different tabs that I have, because this is a very straightforward dashboard. If it's a lot more complicated, you're going to have way more tabs than I do here. Okay, so all of these things you need to be aware of. So do I want to mention anything else? Let's actually, no, I'll talk about calculations when we get to that. Now, I'm just going to close down this file because this was just the completed version. So let's close that down. And I'm just going to reopen the one that I sent you guys. So just bear with me 1 second. And I think I sent you the workbook, didn't I? Yeah. All right. So this file looks slightly different to the one that we were just looking at. I've still got my sales data in a table on the first tab. I've got some extra data, which we're going to use a bit later on. I've got my wireframe just there. I have my calculations and I have my dashboard, which at the moment looks pretty bare. Now, we're going to build up this dashboard. I've already started doing it, again, just to save a bit of time. All I've done here for this heading is I've basically just resized this row by dragging it down, and I've just applied some formatting to the cell. So that's all I've done, and then I've added the text. Now, one thing I would say is that when you're putting together a dashboard, you want it to kind of look as clean and professional as possible. So I always come in here and turn off the grid lines just so I'm starting from a blank canvas and all of my charts look really nice and we don't have these grid lines showing in the background. So let's jump up to the View tab, and I'm going to, in the Show group where we have grid lines, I'm going to deselect, and that's just going to get rid of all of those grid lines and give me a nice blank canvas. So let's start by doing a couple of design changes here, because what I'm going to have is I've got this title at the top. And underneath that, I'm going to have an area where I have my slices. Now, if you're not sure what slices are, they're basically just filters. They're interactive filters you can use to filter your data. And I'm going to have some of these at the top of the page. So I'm going to grab row 2. You can see I've got that double-headed arrow. And I'm just going to drag it down to allow some room for my slices. So slices aren't that big. I think that should be fine. And just so this stands out, I'm going to change the background fill just to a light grey colour. So this is where I'm going to have my slices. Now, underneath that, I'm going to have some top level or high level key metrics that people are interested in. So we're going to add those in at the end. In fact, yeah, we're not going to do those just yet. We're just going to leave our dashboard as it is. Because what we need to do is we need to start constructing our pivot tables and our pivot charts that we want to go on this dashboard. So let's go back to our sales data. And we're going to create our first pivot table and pivot chart. And we're going to create a line chart, which is going to show us the total profit by year. So I'm going to make sure that I'm clicked in my data. We're going to jump up to the insert ribbon. And the first button here is pivot table. So let's click that. I'm going to be creating my pivot table based off of my table range. And you can see here, it's automatically selected it for me, which is perfect. And I'm going to put it on a new worksheet. Now, I would say when you're doing a dashboard, if you've got lots of different pivot tables and pivot charts, you want to make sure you put each one on a new worksheet so that it doesn't get confused with your source data or anything else that you have going on. So I'm going to say, put it on a new worksheet, click on OK. And there we go. I have a new sheet at the bottom, sheet 1, and I'm just going to drag and I'm going to move this to just before where we have dashboard. So now I have a blank pivot table report, which I need to populate with fields. And before I do that, I'm going to make sure that I name everything on here so that I'm being consistent. So the first thing we're going to rename is the worksheet. So currently it just says sheet 1. Let's right click and go to rename. And this is going to be a line chart. So I'm just going to say, this is the pivot table. So PVT underscore, I'm going to call it line chart. I'm also going to make sure that I'm clicked in this blank pivot table report. And if you notice just above where we have pivot table name, it still has the generic name of pivot table 1. So I'm going to name this PVT underscore line underscore chart. Perfect. So what is our first pivot chart going to display? Well, it's going to display the profits by year. So if we cast our eyes over to the right-hand side, we have our pivot table fields. Now, if you're not that familiar with pivot tables, they are really straightforward. What you see here in this pivot table fields area are basically all of the column headings from our source data. So we've got region, country, item type, sales channel, so on and so forth. And we build up our pivot table simply by dragging and dropping any one of these fields into one of these 4 areas down here. And depending on where we drag them, our report is going to display in a different way. So I'm doing a line chart, profit by year. I'm going to I'm going to find total profit. Where is it? There it is. I'm going to drag it down into values. And in the rows, I'm going to go for, let's go for order date. I'm going to drop that down into rows. So you can now see what I have in my pivot table. It's showing me the years, 2015 to 2022, which is what my data set spans, and then the sum of total profit. Now, at the moment, it doesn't look great. It's not really organized as I want it to be, because what happened, if you notice in our pivot table fields, when I dropped in order date, Excel automatically split up my date for me. So it recognized that we have years, we have quarters, and we have the order date. So if I expand 2015, you can see I can break this down into quarters and then the months. So Excel did that automatically for me. Now, in this particular scenario, I only want to see the years. I'm not interested in quarters or anything else. So what I can do is go down to rows, and I'm going to drag quarters out and also order date just to leave the years. I'm probably going to want to apply a little bit of number formatting to this total profit column as well, because it looks kind of messy. So once again, we can just click in this column, right click, and go to number format. And this is the total profit. I'm going to give it accounting format. I'm going to take those decimal places down to 0 and click on OK. So that looks a little bit tidier. So that is our first pivot table. Now from this pivot table, I want to create a line chart. Now, what do I want to include in my line chart? Well, pretty much all of this information, but I don't want to include the grand total. That's not going to make sense. So I'm going to turn off the grand total for this particular pivot table. So once again, I need to make sure I'm clicked inside the pivot table. We're going to go up to the Design tab, into the Layout group, Grand Totals, and we're going to say Off for rows and columns. So now I just have the data that I want to include in that line chart. So once we have our pivot table, we can go to Pivot Table Analyze, Pivot Chart, and then we can choose our chart type. Now I will say when you're creating charts, not all charts are created equally. Some charts are more suited to certain types of data. But I would say that column charts in general are suitable for most types of data. But if you have time-based data like we do here, 2015 to 2022, that's often nicely represented in the form of a line chart. And I want my line chart to have markers. So I'm going to choose line with markers, that option just above, just to give myself those little markers on the year points. Let's click on OK, and we have ourselves a pivot chart. Now, there's a lot of formatting we could do here to make this look really fancy. As I said, we don't have a great deal of time to go through formatting, but I am going to do a few different things with this. Now, the first thing that I always do in general when I'm working with pivot charts, because I want them to look as clean as possible. I don't want them to be too fussy. So I'm going to remove these grey filter buttons, because if I want to filter the charts on my dashboard, I'm going to use a slicer, or I could come here and use the pivot table. So I'm going to right click on the grey buttons and I'm going to say hide all field buttons on chart, just to get rid of those. What else can I get rid of? Well, let's take a look at this total, the legend over here. That's not really showing me any information. So I'm going to get rid of this. And the thing is, with things like the legend, they are simply text boxes. So I can just select it and press the delete key just to get rid of that legend. I might want to add a little title. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about these chart titles because I'm actually going to give them all different chart titles when we put them on the dashboard. But just so I remember what this chart represents, this is the, let's say, total profit by year. That'll do for now. And of course, I could do other types of formatting. So currently those markers don't really stand out too much. So maybe I want to change the color scheme that I'm using in here. So I can go up to the Design tab and I'm going to go to Change Colors, and let's make this a purple color. And if I wanted to change the chart style, I could maybe choose something from up here. I've got all different kinds of choices. So let's go for that one. That looks quite nice. And I think I'm going to leave it like that. Now, currently, take a look at this line. And we can see very clearly that there was a massive dip in profits in 2017. So this is why visualizing our data in this type of way is really useful, because maybe if I'm the salesperson, I might want to investigate a little bit further as to why we had such a large dip in sales in that year in particular. Now, if you wanted to, for example, I've got a lot of space in between that point and all of this down here. I've got this big old blank space. If I wanted to make this line a little bit more centered on this particular chart, I could change the way that this axis looks. Now, if I right click on the axes and go to Format Axes, this is where I could change things like the bounds. So you can see here where it says minimum, it starts at 0. So if I didn't want this line to appear so high up in that plot area, I could maybe change this to something like 100. Is it 100,000 or it's 100 million? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if I click away, you can see that that's going to pull it down, and it just looks a little bit nicer on the actual chart. So you can change things like that as you go through. So that is my first chart, profit by year. Let's move on to a slightly more interesting chart. Now, if you are building lots of pivot charts to put on a dashboard, one thing we want to be making sure that we're doing this as efficiently as possible. So in general, what I do is I will copy the worksheet delete out the chart, and then just change the pivot table. I find that's quicker than having to go back to the sales data and create a brand new pivot chart from there. So a quick way to copy this particular worksheet that we're on is to hold down the control key, click, and just drag off to the side. When you let go, you're going to get an exact copy. So I'm going to right click and let's rename this, because the next one we're doing is we're doing a pivot table, and this is going to be a map. So now I can simply just delete out that chart and then rearrange my pivot table fields, because I want to display a different metric in this chart. So this time I want to see the average units sold by country. So I don't need years in rows. I don't need the total profit in values. What I want instead is units sold down here. And I want this by country. So let's grab the country field and drop that into rows. Now we have a lot of information here. There's a lot of countries in there. Now, because of the type of chart that we're doing, that's absolutely fine. We're doing a map chart, which basically just colorizes the country on a map. I wouldn't have this much data if I was doing something like a column chart, because can you imagine the axes with this? It would be absolutely horrendous and nobody would be able to read it. So that is what I mean by not every chart is suitable for the data that you want to represent. So we're doing a map chart, so this is absolutely fine to leave this in a big long list. But what else do I want to do here? Right, notice that it's showing the sum of the units sold, whereas I want it to display the average units sold by country. So how can I change this from doing a sum to doing an average? Well, there's a few different ways, but we can go down to our values area in our pivot table fields, click the little drop down arrow and go to value field settings. So this is where we can choose how this field is summarized. So currently it's doing a sum. I want it to do an average. Let's click on OK. And now it's showing me the average of the units sold. Once again, I want to apply some number formatting. Right click, number format. And these are just numbers. It's just the number of units sold. It's not currency. So we're going to take the decimal places down and click on OK. And now I have my average units sold by country. Once again, I'm going to go up to Pivot Table Analyze and I'm going to name this table. Because we copied the sheet, notice it's still called PVT line chart, but we want this to be called PVT map. Oops, map chart. So now that we have this data, I want to represent it in a map chart. But there is one issue that you're going to come across. So let's take a look at it. Let's go to Pivot Table Analyze, Pivot Chart. And one of the chart types in here is map. Now notice what I get. I get a little message. You can't create this chart type with data inside a pivot table. And that's really important. If you want to use pivot table data in a map chart, you have to pull it out of the pivot table first of all, which is a little bit of a pain. Fortunately, it is quite simple. All we need to do is click somewhere in the data, Control A to select everything, Control C to copy, and I'm just going to paste it over here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just paste the values only. So up on the home ribbon, click the lower half of the paste button, and we're going to say paste values. So that gives me all of the data, but it's not in a pivot table anymore. So what I can then do with this selected is create just a regular map chart. So this time we're going to insert into maps and filled map. And depending on how much data you've got, this can take a couple of seconds for it to pull through everything, but that is what we get. So you can see here that the countries are kind of shaded in a gradient fill depending on the number of units sold. So the darker the fill, the higher the number of units sold. And this is quite a nice way of representing geographical data. Now, the problem that we have here, because we've now created this chart based off of data that isn't in a pivot table, if this data was to update, the chart isn't going to change. So once we've created the chart, we then need to point it back to the pivot table data. So with it selected, we're going to go up to the chart design ribbon, select data, I'm going to delete out the data range that we're using, and I'm just going to go back and select columns A and B. So it's now going to use the pivot table data again. So it's a bit of a pain. You can't create it from pivot data, but you can point it back to use that data. Once we've done that, I can then go in and delete out everything that we have in here. So a little bit of a workaround there to get your map charts to work based off of your pivot data. So once again, let's do a little bit of formatting. There isn't a great deal that we can do with map charts, but if we go up to the chart design tab, I'm going to choose a different chart style. Let's go for something like that. Looks a little bit nicer. I'm also going to change the colors. We've got a purple theme going on. Let's make it purple. And just so I remember, I'm going to name this. This is the average units. Oops, I can't type tonight. My hands are so cold. By country. There we go. So there is chart number 2, which we're going to put on our dashboard. How are we doing for time, guys? Oh, not too bad. I thought I would be later than that. Let's do our third chart, which is going to be a bar chart. Oh, before we do that, I want to make sure that I name my pivot chart. Oh no, we can't name this one because, sorry, ignore what I just said there. We're going to go on to creating our third chart. So once again, I'm going to grab the tab and I'm going to make a copy. Now this map chart, because it's using so much data, this can be a little bit slow. So I'm going to copy the line chart again. So let's hold down Control, drag and drop it where we want it to be so that we get our copy. I'm going to right click, I'm going to rename, and we're going to call this one, what are we calling this one? Pivot, so PVT underscore bar underscore chart. Let's delete out the charts and let's take a look at the data that we're displaying. So in this one, I want to show the revenue by sales channel. So once again, I'm going to remove years from rows and total profit. And we want revenue by sales channel. So let's drag the sales channel down into rows. And we want the total revenue, which is just here. So again, a really nice, straightforward little table. Is this the one that I want for the bar charts? Sorry, I want to display this as sales channel and item type. So we're going to combine item type with the sales channel. We're going to drop that into rows as well. So I can see all of the offline sales for all of the different items or different categories and all of the online sales as well. Now, again, this is quite a lot of information to display in a bar chart. If I was to go to Pivot Table Analyze and click on Pivot Chart and choose Bar, you can sort of see what that's going to look like. It's not even showing me all of the items, the different categories. I'd have to make this a really tall table in order to see all of those. So if you do have a lot of data and you're trying to cram it into a certain chart type, one little thing I would say to do is maybe start applying a filter to just show the top 3 or the top 5. That can be a lot better than trying to show absolutely everything. So that's what we're going to do with this data to display just the top 3 as opposed to all of the different categories, the different items. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and change the number formatting. So this is the total revenue. I'm going to go for accounting, take the decimal places down to 0 and click on OK. And I'm just going to display the top 3 items. So if you want to apply a filter, we can right click, go to filter, and we have a top 10 filter in here. So the name of this filter is a little bit deceiving because you don't have to display 10, you can display as many as you like. So my management team are only interested in the top 3 categories of products, the total revenue for those particular categories. So let's go for 3. Click on OK, and now you can see I have a much smaller data set, which I can comfortably manage in a bar chart. So don't forget about things like that. You can refine your data before putting it into a table, into a chart. So let's go up to Pivot Chart, and we're going to choose Bar Chart again. Click on OK. And that looks a lot better. We need to do some tidying up here. Let's right click and hide all field buttons to get rid of those grey buttons. The total isn't doing a great deal for me again, so let's just get rid of the legend. Let's delete that out. And what I'm going to do here is, instead of having the values in the horizontal axes underneath, I'm going to add these as data labels on the actual bars. I think that looks a lot more effective sometimes, and it also takes up less room. So I'm going to click on my bars, and I'm going to make these bars a little bit wider. Let's right click, Format Data Series. And notice here, I can change the gap width between these bars. So if I drag this down, it's going to make those bars essentially a lot thicker than they currently are. So you can make these as wide or as narrow as you want. So I quite like that look. I think they look better, a little bit thicker. What else do I want to do here? Let's go to formatting. Actually, let's format the data series. Well, that's the same place I was in. If I go to fill, I can change the colors of these bars as well. But if I choose vary colors by point, it's going to recolor them all for me based on the theme that I have in use in Excel. And each bar is going to be a different color. So that looks quite nice. I think I'm going to leave it like that. Now, to add the data labels, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete this horizontal axis, like so. Looks a lot cleaner as soon as we do that. I'm going to click on my bars, and you can either use the plus just here, or you can right click and you can add data labels from the right click menu. And if we add data labels, we can then choose to display them on the inside end. And for me, that sometimes looks a lot nicer than having them on the horizontal axis or on the outside. If I select the first one, I can apply formatting. So let's go to the Home tab. I'm going to change these to, let's make them white, and I'm going to make them bold. And I think those look quite nice. If you wanted to do something like make these bars really stand out, you could choose to add a border around the outside. Again, just make sure that you select them. And when you select one, it will select all. And then we can go up to the Format tab, and we can apply a shape outline. So maybe I just want to do a grey outline just to make those stand out from the background. Another thing I'm going to do is delete the grid lines. So just click on one, it will select them all, press delete. The last thing to do here is simply to add a chart title. As I said, we are going to replace these, but just so I can remember what they are, this is the, I'm just going to say revenue by item and sales channel, like so. And there is our third chart. The final chart we're going to do is just a very quick little donut chart. It's the pie chart's favorite cousin. So I'm going to copy the worksheet once again, hold down Control, drag and drop. Same old process. Let's right click, let's rename. This is going to be pivot _ donut. Always makes me hungry when I'm doing a donut chart. Let's delete out the chart. Let's click in our pivot table, and we're going to remove the rows, both of those, and the values. And in our donut chart, we're going to just show the count of orders, and we're going to do this by, should we do this by region? Yeah, let's do it by region. So let's drag region into rows. And I'm going to add, we're doing a count of the actual orders. So for this, I can use the order ID, because every time there's an order, it gets assigned a unique order ID. So I can drag this down to values. Once again, by default, Excel is going to try and sum together all of the order numbers. We want it to do a count as opposed to a sum. We want it to count the orders. So we can jump into value field settings and choose count, like so. Now, once again, I only have a few different regions just here. So let's see how that looks in a donut chart, because the thing, pie charts and donut charts in general are not my favorite types of chart. They're quite limited with how much data you can actually display in them. And I find that pie charts and donut charts are generally good for when you have maybe 2 or 3 things that you want to kind of represent in that chart. Any more than that, and it starts to get a little bit confusing. And there are other chart types that are much better at displaying that data. So let's have a quick look. We might have to apply a filter or do something. I'm not sure. Let's see. Pivot charts. Now you'll find your donut chart underneath the pie category. And it's this one at the end here. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad actually. Let's leave that as it is. Let's go OK. There is our donut chart. Let's do some tidying. We're going to right click, hide all fill buttons on the chart. The legend is a bit untidy, but it can't be helped. So I'm going to leave that there. What I am going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of formatting to this donut. This hole in the middle of the donut is way too big. So let's select it, right click, format data series, and we can change the donut hole size. So I'm going to drag this down, and you can make this as big or as small as you want. And what I see a lot of people do if they have something like this is they might add something like an icon in the middle there just to give it a little bit more visual interest. One thing I am going to do with this is I am going to add data labels so that we can see the actual number of orders per segment. So once again, we can click on the plus, we can go to data labels, and yep, there we go. Let's make this a little bit bigger. I'm just going to drag it out. And as I said, you might want to fiddle around with this a little bit more. I'm going to make those, shall I make them white? Yeah, why not? And bold, just to display. All right, let's give it an old name. So this one is, I'm going to call this number of orders by region. And there we go. There is our fourth chart. Now, I've forgotten to name a lot of these. As I said, it's always going to work out better if you make sure that you name things as you go through. I haven't. We are limited for time. So just pretend that I did that for all of them. Because what we need to do now is we can start moving these across to our dashboard and arranging them as we want. Now, let's go to the dashboard, because what I want is, before I have these charts, I want to have some what we call cards at the top, just showing some key metrics. Now, where are my key metrics going to come from? Well, they're going to come from my calculations worksheet. So if we go over here, I've already done this because I knew we wouldn't have enough time in an hour to go through exactly how I've calculated all of this. But just understand, in column A, I have the key metrics that I want to display at the top of my dashboard. So these are really the things that in one glance you can just see exactly what you're looking for. So maybe my manager wants to know straight away what the most profitable item is, what the most profitable region is. Maybe he wants to see the count of cancelled orders, how many people have cancelled. And maybe he wants to see the top sales channel. Is it online or offline? So this information isn't going to be represented in any form of chart. It's just going to be there at the top. But we want to construct it so that if our data changes, the original source data, and maybe the top sales channel changes, we want to make sure that it also changes on the dashboard. So we need to start performing some calculations on a different worksheet and then linking them through to our dashboard. So I've already done them, but just so you understand what you're looking at and the type of thing that you can do. And this is where dashboards can start to get really complex when you start to have lots and lots of different calculations. So let's start with the most profitable item or category. You can see here this little table and the one underneath. So basically, in order to find out what the most profitable item is, and I can see it at the bottom here, it's cosmetics, what I've had to do is a couple of different calculations. Now, if you take a look in the formula bar, you can see I've used the unique formula, which will give me a unique list of values from whatever column I've selected. So it's basically looking at my sales data spreadsheet at the item type column, and it's pulling back all of the unique entries. So if you go to sales data and look at item type, you'll see we have baby food and, all these different ones are repeated throughout this column. We just want a unique list of each one. So that is where the unique function is really good. So I just have a long list of those, and I want to find out the total profit for each of these item types. So once again, if you take a look in the formula bar, I've done a sum if calculation. And sum if is one of my favorite formulas. It basically allows you to sum together values based off of a condition. So this sum if has basically said, look at the sales data worksheet and add together the profit whenever the item type is baby food, snacks, beverages, so on and so forth. So it's summing with a condition. So now that I have all of that, I can work out what the maximum value is because I'm looking for the most profitable item out of all of these. So at the bottom here, I've done a max calculation on this data above. So we're looking for the maximum value in the cell range C5 to C16. And that is that value just there. And I've worked out which item that this value corresponds to using a lookup. So I've used index and match to look in this table for the maximum value and return what item type it relates to, which is cosmetics. So I've done a few different calculations there to get kind of where I need to be. But because of the way I've constructed this and everything links back to that source data, if anything changes, it's going to feed through to my calculations worksheet, which is in turn going to feed through to my dashboard. So everything is always going to be kept up to date. Now, I don't want to linger too much on this, but I've done a similar thing to find the most profitable region. I've created a unique list of the regions. I've done a sum-if calculation to find the total profit by region. I've found the maximum value, and I've done a lookup to find out what the region is that relates to that maximum value. So exactly the same to find out the key metric for this second one. The count of cancelled orders, well, that was fairly straightforward. All I had to do was a count if. I just want to count the orders column where it says cancelled. So that is how I've got to that value. We then have the top sales channel. So just here, again, I haven't bothered doing a unique because there's only 2 of them. I've just typed online and offline. We've done a count if this time because I want to count the orders. I've done a max and then we've done a lookup again. So very similar, it's just using count if as opposed to sum if. So hopefully this gives you an idea as to the types of things you can do lots of weird and wonderful calculations and then have it all feed through to your dashboard. So with all of that in mind, what I can now do is go back to my dashboard and start pulling everything together. And we've got about 10 minutes left, so we should be able to do this. So let's start out with those calculations. How do I want those to look? So again, you can spend a lot more time doing this than I am, but I'm just going to add some basic shapes. This is where the dashboard design comes in, and I am not the most design-orientated person, but let's just do something. Let's add a little square, rectangle. I'm going to make this, let's make it a dark pink color. I'm going to say no outline. And I'm going to add a title to this. So this one is going to be the most profitable item. So let's right click, edit text, and I'm just going to make this caps. We'll just say most profitable item. And we're going to center it. This is just basic formatting skills. We'll center it in the middle, horizontally and vertically. I'm going to make it a different font. Let's make it stand out a bit. And I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, size 14. So I like to apply all my formatting to the first one, and then I'm just going to duplicate it 3 more times. Control D, Control D, Control D. I'm going to roughly drag these into position. So I'll put them along there. These don't have to be perfect. You just sort of have to get them into some kind of order. Because then what we can do is select them all, holding down the shift, and we can use our alignment tools to put them exactly in the correct position. So with all of these selected, if we go to shape format, into align, I'm going to align them to the top, and I'm going to say distribute horizontally, and that's going to make those look perfect. Now with all of these still selected, I'm going to press Control D again to duplicate all of them, and I'm going to drag these directly underneath the other ones, like so. And I'm going to make these a slightly different color. So let's go for a lighter pink for those. As I said, you can spend more time doing this, but what we want under here is this is where we want to actually display that key metric that we've got on the calculations tab. So how do we get that to pull through? Well, we need to make sure that we're clicked within the shape, but then we immediately want to go up to the formula bar and type equals. We can then jump across to our calculations worksheet, and our most profitable item, we just need to link to that cell. So that's right at the bottom where we have cosmetics. Let's click that cell and press enter, and it's going to pull it straight through to the dashboard. Now I'm going to apply my formatting at the end. Let's do the next one. Let's type, oh, sorry, I always do that. You don't type equals in the shape. You have to do it in the formula bar for this to work. So equals, go back to our calculations. We then want the most profitable region. Press enter. Same thing for the rest of these. So let's delete out what we have in there. Click in the formula bar, equals. And we want, what do we want for this one? Is this cancelled orders? I think so. Oh, I need to change those headings, don't I? That would be helpful. Let's delete out the last one. Click, equals. Let's go back to calculations. And the last calculation that we want is the sales channel, and hit enter. So now I need to go in and change these headings. So this is most profitable region. So let's just change, oops. This is the number of cancelled orders. And this one is top sales channel, like so. So now that I have those linked through, I'm going to apply my formatting. So once again, I want to make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to make it bold, and let's change the font to a darker pink. Now I do this at the end because then I can just use Format Painter to do it for the rest of them. So with this one selected, this first one, if we click on Format Painter twice, that's going to allow us to just select the other ones. Press the escape to come out of Format Painter. So now this is completely dynamic. If anything changes in the source data, these key metrics at the top are also going to change. What we can then do is just bring across our charts that we created. So let's go back to our first line chart. Let's Control C, go back to the dashboard, Control V, and then we can move it into place. I'm just going to put that there. We then want our map chart, Control C. This one, because it's got a lot of data, it can be a little laggy, as you can see, but it does come through eventually. That's perfect. I'm going to position that somewhere around there. And you can drag these around and make them look a little bit nicer if you want. I'm going to just make these all nice and even. So let's drag them there. The next one is a bar chart. Control C, back to the dashboard. Control V, and place that one underneath. And I'm going to drag it across. And then finally we have the donut chart, which I kind of think looks a little bit messy, but this is why I don't like pie and donut charts. I'm not a fan, if you can't tell. And then we can drag that so that everything's all nice and even. Now, one thing that I would also probably do is remove the borders off of these charts as well, because I just want to make everything look as if it's part of this dashboard. And you can't do this all in one go. You have to do them all individually. So select the first chart. We want to go up to Format and just change the shape outline to no outline. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for all of these so that they really look like they're all sort of melded into one dashboard and they're part of this dashboard. So let's just do the last one and click on no outline. There we go. I'm sure you can make yours look a lot nicer than mine. Now, the thing with these headings, they're all very inconsistent. And this is why I said it doesn't really matter, because what in general I do if I'm constructing a dashboard is I add my own headings so that I can format them individually. And again, I would just do that using something like shapes. So maybe I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. I'm going to drag this along like that. And let's make it, I'm going to make this a blue color with no outline. And I'm going to add some text into this, and that is going to be the title. So I'm going to say, oops, total profit by year. And then I can change the formatting if I want, make all of the font consistent, make it a bit bigger if I want to, and then I would probably delete out the heading in the chart because it just makes the chart look a lot cleaner. And I would add one of these, so I'd duplicate this, and I would add one for each of my charts. It just, again, just adds to giving it a nice, consistent looking feel. Now, I'm not going to do it because we are running out of time. Hopefully you get the idea as to how that would look if we do it for all of these. Now, the final couple of things, we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to try and get to the end. I just want to show you how to add some slices. So I left a little gap at the top here, this little gray area, where we can add in some interactive slices. And slices just act as filters, which we can click on, and it changes what's displayed on our dashboard. So you can add slices by clicking on any one of these charts. And if you right click, you have in here, they renamed it recently. If I go to, just bear with me because I know they renamed these. They're not going to let me do that. No, it's not going to let me do it. They've renamed the button. It used to be called Report Connections, and now it's called Filter Connections, but it's not letting me do it from the dashboard. So I'm going to go to the actual chart. Is it going to let me do it from here? No. Sorry, hang on. Let's go up. I'm getting confused here. You don't need to do report connections. Sorry. Let's click on this first chart. I need to insert the slicer before I try and connect it. Duh. Pivot chart analyze, insert slicer. Now, these slices are going to be presented. Again, you're going to get all of the column headings in your data, and you can choose whatever you want to filter or slice your data up with. So maybe I want to add a slicer for the sales channel and the order priority. Let's click on OK. And these act as little filters, and we can customize these and make them look as if they're part of our dashboard. Now, we are running out of time, but I will just quickly show you a little bit of this. I'm going to click on the slicer, up to the slicer ribbon at the top. Notice we have a contextual ribbon, and I'm going to change the columns from 1 to 2 so that those two slicers are on the same row. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to remove the heading to make this look a bit cleaner. Let's right click and go down to slicer settings, because in here we can deselect display header, click on OK, and that looks just a little bit nicer. What we can also do is we can change that background fill so that it blends into that grey background. Now for this, we need to effectively duplicate the style that this slicer is using. And if you take a look above where we have slicer styles, you can see the one selected is the one that's in use, this kind of greeny color. So what I can do is right click and say duplicate, and then I can modify. So I'm going to call this just my initials, slicer style. And the only thing I want to do with fill. So if I go to, I think it's whole slicer, go to format, and from here we can remove the background fill. And that says no color, doesn't it? Just bear with me 1 second. I'm just confused because it already says it's got no color, but it's quite clearly got a white background fill just there. Which one am I going to need to select? Is it that one? No, one of these, which you format, will remove that white background fill. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, again, you can fiddle around with this and get these to look as you want, but you can remove that background fill from within your slicer styles. I'm just not sure which one of these controls that one. And then you can make these look as if they're part of that grey background and click on them to filter the different charts below. So these act as I said, a little filter, which just let you see your charts displayed in different ways. And I would do the same with this one. If we go to slicer, I would display this on one row. So I want to increase those columns. I would drag this across, and I would have these sitting at the top here, which just serve as a really nice way for people who maybe aren't used to using Excel. It's sort of fairly obvious that you can click on these buttons to kind of extract the information that you're interested in. So I will leave these just because we're under heavy time constraints at the moment to have a play around with these, but just know that you can format them by modifying the slicer style. You can remove this white background and make it look a lot neater than I have done here. Now, the final thing to note here is with these slicers, they will not be connected to all of your charts. So if I click on something online in this slicer, can you see that it did change that total profit by year chart? You can see what's going on down here. Now, if I wanted to control the other charts, we need to connect our slicers to our other charts. And this is what I was getting confused about earlier. We need to right-click on the slicer and report connections. This will tell us which charts our slicer is currently controlling. And this is why it's important to make sure that you name your charts correctly. So you can see here, sheet, I've got pivot bar chart, pivot donut, pivot line. Because I didn't name the actual chart, you can see here it says pivot line, pivot. So it's all a bit of a mess over here. So this is why it's important to name them correctly. But I can tell by the sheet which one. So I basically want the slicers to control all of the charts on my dashboard. So I'm going to basically select all of them for this. And now if I select various different things, it's going to change in all of the charts. So you can see that that map chart is now updating. So you're going to find that you need to do that for all of your slicers. Check the report connections and connect them to whichever charts you want them to control. That might be all of the charts. It might be just one or two that you have on your dashboard. But if you don't do that, it's only going to control the first one on your dashboard. Now I'm going to get rid of these because they look hideous because I haven't been able to remove that background fill. Hopefully you get the idea though. And let's see, what's the time? We're slightly over the very, very last point, which is a very important point, updating your dashboard. So if we go back to our sales data, you can see I've got an extra data tab down here. So if this is, let's say this is the next year's sales, what I can do is select the data, Control A, Control C to copy, and I'm going to paste it onto the bottom of the data in the sales data tab. Now let's make sure that we're all the way across. We are. Control V to paste in, and I'm just going to delete out the heading. And if you've got your data in a table, you should find that it is going to update automatically. Now, did I not put this one in a table? I don't think I did I? Sorry. I'm going to put it back in a table. If you've done that before, when you paste in new data, it's going to automatically add on to the bottom. So tables auto expand to accommodate whatever you add. So now, if we have it in a table, if we want to update our dashboard, we can simply go back to here and then we just need to refresh it. So if we go to Pivot Chart Analyze, we've got a refresh button in the middle, and I think we should see something like number of cancelled orders should change. Let's go to Refresh All. No, because I did it the wrong way round. Oh, God, it's a bit of a disaster at the end, guys. The problem that I'm having is that I think I got confused. When I was showing you the completed spreadsheet, I already put that one in a table. When I came to the workbook, I didn't actually put it in a table, and I forgot to do that right at the beginning, which is a very big error. What should happen is if you have your data in a table, when you build your dashboard, if you add data into the bottom, the dashboard can be updated simply by clicking on refresh, and everything will pull through nicely. I haven't done that, so it's not updating. So I can't have that wow moment at the end where everything all updates nicely. So I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you get the idea. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.